So you've got Napoleon facing off against Wellington, except that it's not actually Wellington's body. You've got the big knees up about how much port we're going to drink over the course of the Waterloo dinner.
Naturally.
So hello and welcome to a very special edition of the Napoleonic Wars pod.
And welcome to Apsley House.
It's not a bad gaff for an episode, is it?
It's really not.
Now, if you know a certain Matthew Taylor, and frankly, if you've been listening to the podcast for a while, then you absolutely will. Matt Taylor has organised a Waterloo Weekend celebration. It features some names that you might be familiar with, a certain Dr. Graeme Callister, a certain Dr. Matthew Taylor, and some bloke called Luke A. Reynolds?
Yes, Luke A. Reynolds is correct, actually.
Luke A. Reynolds.
It is. It's Luke A. L. Reynolds is the full
Yes,
name,
yes,
so
yes,
the joke is actually valid.
He's being clever again, folks. Apologies.
We are lucky enough to be here in the Waterloo Gallery, or the Picture Gallery at Apsley House. We're going to be giving you a tour of the building, fundamentally, because they've foolishly given us carte blanche.
Such a big mistake. Give us the run of the place with a camera.
Oh man, it's going to be fun. To start with, let's talk about this monument here.
Don't touch it.
I'm not touching it, I'm just pretending to touch it. I know how cameras work. This is one of the 1.25 ton marble candelabras that were gifted to Wellington by the Tsar of Russia. And because they are 1.25 tons, they're not movable. So for balls, it was no problem because you generally dance in a circular pattern, so you would dance around them. And for the Waterloo Banquet and other state dinners, he had a table built that literally latched together around it.
It's very sort of aristocratic problems, isn't it?
It is.
I've got this lovely candelabra. I'm going to have a custom table made because honestly, I just can't get the seating sorted otherwise.
I mean, honestly, I'm pretty sure the first thought was genuinely, we have to reinforce the floor and then we'll build the custom table.
Well, they did that for the massive nude buff statue of Napoleon.
They did.
Which
They
is a bit
absolutely
ironic, really, that Wellington goes downstairs for breakfast every day and just gets confronted by Napoleon with nothing beyond a fig leaf covering his modesty.
Yeah, I mean, and Wellington made an entire career out of snatching that fig leaf away, so...
It's a way of making money, for sure.
It is. Well, I mean, clearly. This is not exactly a rent-controlled apartment.
It's not, is it?
No.
It's not. The decor probably gives that one away.
Inspired by Versailles.
Unsurprisingly, although not enough mirrors for Versailles, for
So
my liking.
the shutters actually originally did have mirrors on them to close, and obviously we have the two at the ends, and also inspired by Versailles and thankfully overridden by a later duke, but this was originally walled in yellow damask.
I prefer the red.
I agree.
I prefer the red.
I agree, and actually so did the original architect. There was an entire letter exchange back and forth about this. It's one of the reasons why Mrs. Arbuthnot took over, really, the planning, is because the Duke sort of went, I can't deal with this anymore. I want yellow. I'm paying, which is a valid point.
That one's fair.
And damn it, it's going to be yellow. And the architect sort of went, oh God, can we not? And so...
And then Harriet Arbuthnot just came and dealt with the situation as was her way.
Poured oil on the water.
So this is the benefit, as you can imagine, of having somebody who's studied the memory and the legacy of Waterloo in a place like this. We'll be bringing you some fantastic content, specifically filmed for you guys and for social media. But the bulk of today's episode, if you stuck with us this long, is to bring you the talks themselves, the talks of the historians who are here today to impart their wisdom on the Battle of Waterloo, apart from the talk by a certain Dr. Zack White, in which case he's going to waffle about flogging and crime and other fun stuff.
Zack, the English Vice White, is coming?
Well, it has been known. It has been known. So, folks, what follows over the next couple of hours are recordings of those very talks. Please do sit back and enjoy. And importantly, not only please remember to like and subscribe, but crucially, come to Number 1 London.
Yes.
Come to Apsley House. If you're a member of English Heritage, you can get in for free. Otherwise, it's a very reasonable entrance fee. There are some incredible paintings, both Dutch in origin, Spanish in origin, but also, crucially, pictures like the Waterloo dinner painting, the iconic one that's on this guy's book.
Waterloo Banquet, 1836, painted in 1840 by William Salter.
Yeah, all right.
But actually, while we're on the subject of paintings in this room in particular, the anchor of this superb collection is, of course, over 100 paintings from the Spanish Royal Collection, which Wellington famously rescued, or Wellington's troops rescued, from the French baggage train after Victoria. There is a story, and I'm genuinely not sure if it's an urban legend or if it is true, but I love it too much to not share it, that when he had them all hung, he invited the Royal Academy, or the leaders of the Royal Academy, in to come and see them. And apparently the leader of the Royal Academy stopped in front of one of them, I believe it was a Caravaggio, and looked at it and went, "This is worth fighting the Battle of Vittoria for all by itself." Which would have been news to the thousands of men who died that day.
See, I thought you were going to go with the story that Wellington is given the crates with these, because the point is that Joseph Bonaparte does what the Bonapartes and the French do very well over the course of the Napoleonic Wars, which is, oh, something shiny, magpie mode, I'm going to take that back to France with me.
The horses of St. Mark have entered the chat.
Haven't they just? So go to Venice and you'll know what we're talking about, because they're not the originals that stand outside anymore.
So I just found out recently that actually in the Great War between Genoa and Venice, Genoa famously boasted that they were going to bridle the horses of St. Mark. That was sort of their war cry. And they never did it because Venice sealed them in the lagoon and basically took advantage. But Napoleon did. Napoleon
certainly did. But the story, to go back to the Vittoria paintings, the story is the Redcoat sees, as we know, King Joseph's abandoned baggage train. Wellington gets given this cart full of paintings and sort of vaguely opens a few of them and goes, oh yeah, no, these are quite nice. And just has them shipped back to Blighty. Then somebody opens up the cart, or the crate, when it gets back to the UK and suddenly goes, do you realise quite what these are? At which point Wellington goes, I've just stolen the royal collection here, haven't
yes,
I?
You have.
I'd better write to the King of Spain and offer them back, at which point, very magnanimously, the King of Spain says, you helped to liberate our country. I consider them due payment for your services rendered, which is not a bad way to
no,
be
it's
paid
not.
for.
Better to ask forgiveness than permission.
So it would seem. So folks, please enjoy the talks that are coming, and please do visit number 1 London, Apsley House, the home of the Duke of Wellington.
Thanks all very much for coming today, and welcome to our first talk on the Battle of Waterloo. This is actually going to be a two-parter, so for the first part we are going to take you up to about the middle of the battle, and in the second part we'll get towards the end and then you can find out who won. We don't know. It's a surprise. But I suppose before we talk about the battle, we should introduce ourselves very briefly. My name is Dr. Graeme Callister. I'm a Napoleonic scholar and I work at York St John University. And with me is Michael Rayner.
And I'm involved with the Battlefields Trust in particular, helping to set it up back in the 1990s and write on various aspects of military history, especially the fields themselves, the terrain.
So how we're going to do this is I will talk mostly about the French side, and Michael will mostly tell you about the British side, so you can boo me, cheer Michael, as you wish. But I suppose we should say how we're going to get to Waterloo. So why are we, as an Allied army, as a French army, why are we in Belgium in June of 1815? Well, as most of you will probably know, Napoleon has been in charge of France from 1799 through to 1814, when a coalition of the Allied powers of Europe, and by this stage just about everyone in Europe was in that coalition, have marched on Paris, beaten his armies, and overthrown him, sent him to exile in Elba. Napoleon, though, being Napoleon, does not like exile, so 10 months later decides to come back to France. Some call it an escape, some say he was within his rights. We can get into that later. But he returns to France, takes power in a fantastic march north where the army desert to join him, and by the 20th of March he is back as emperor. But of course the powers of Europe aren't going to accept that. And so, when they hear of his escape, the major powers, plus most of the middling states, all agree to mobilize their armies to try to remove Napoleon once and for all. And Napoleon knows this, and he knows that the only way that France can compete against the whole of Europe is if he can take out some of those armies before the rest can mobilize. So while Russia and Austria are mobilizing their armies in the east, trying to march towards the Rhine, the only real armies concentrated against France are in the Low Countries. An army under Wellington with a corps of British soldiers, but also Dutch, Belgian, Nassauers, Brunswickers, Hanoverians, very much a multinational force, and another army under Prince Blucher, which is mostly Prussians, some Saxons who get sent home before the campaign starts. So Napoleon has decided that he is going to try to win this campaign, beat Wellington, beat Blucher before the rest of the armies can assemble. So, on the 15th of June, 1815, he launches his French army across the border. His aim is to get between Wellington and Blucher, push them apart, and beat them both independently. On the 16th of June, he is concentrated just about between the two of them, and he fights a battle against the Prussians at a place called Ligny. He wins this battle. It's a very, very hard fight, but he does win it, and the Prussians are pushed back north. But at the same time, another action is going on with the army under the Duke of Wellington.
And that one is at Quatre Bras, not far from Ligny, and it was unexpected by Wellington. The French had pushed up towards this vital crossroads, and Wellington's army was dispersed over a very wide area of southern Belgium, as it is now, with only a brigade or two of Dutch-Belgian troops in the vicinity where the French were trying to thrust north. Luckily, the local commanders realised the importance of their position, stayed where they were, and then Wellington concentrated his army at Quatre Bras, where they fought a holding action against the French under Marshal Ney, and honours were roughly even at the end of the day. The Allied army held its ground, but with the Prussians retreating north after Ligny, Wellington also had to retreat so that his left flank wouldn't get attacked by the French under Napoleon coming across from Ligny. So on the 17th of June, Wellington went north and positioned his army on a low ridge just south of Waterloo at Mont Saint-Jean. And the French, meanwhile...
So the French have followed Wellington north. Napoleon on the 17th, the day after Ligny and Quatre Bras, decides to break his army into two. He will take most of it, 70,000 men or so, and he will chase after Wellington. But he takes 30,000 men, gives them to Marshal Grouchy, and tells them to pursue the Prussians. The idea is to stop the Prussians from interfering in anything that Napoleon's going to do against Wellington. Now, the 17th of June was a day like today, excessively hot, a little unpleasant. I say excessively hot, I'm from the north. It is very hot down here today. But a thunderstorm breaks out early afternoon, and the French troops march after Wellington's army in a torrential rainstorm. And the rain slows them down, and so they can't quite catch up. And so when Wellington has taken this position on his ridgeline, just south of the village of Mont Saint-Jean, the French have to stop as well. And they stop about a mile south on another low ridge near a place called La Belle Alliance, meaning the beautiful alliance in French. Quite a good name for what's about to happen, I suppose. Now, Napoleon lines his army up on this low ridge line with his first corps on the right, his second corps on the left, his cavalry behind them in reserve, and the Imperial Guard as his kind of final reserve. The Imperial Guard, the best of Napoleon's soldiers. He also has 6th Corps, another corps of infantry, but they're not quite on the battlefield yet. They won't turn up until the next morning. So he lines up there opposite Wellington, and he's expecting a battle the next day. And the next day, when dawn breaks, the rain finally stops at about 5 in the morning. Wellington is still there, himself lined up, and a battle is about to commence.
And Wellington was only still there because he had received assurances from the Prussian commander Blucher that he would march to his aid with at least a corps of men, and hopefully more than that. And those men would be essential to A, to Wellington standing and fighting, and B, to the outcome of the battle. Wellington's positions along that ridge, as we've said, he had a very mixed army, and that's reflected in how they were deployed, with different units from different nationalities spread out along the ridge. In front of his ridge, there were three main bastions. On Wellington's right, the Chateau of Hougoumont with a large wood. In the centre, La Haye Sainte, a farmhouse on the main road from Brussels down to the border of France. And on his left, another strong farmhouse position at Papelotte, and some other smaller hamlets as well.
So the plan is basically for Wellington to hold on to that position until the Prussians can arrive. Now you are in the British positions, we are in the French lines, so the Prussians are coming from that way, about 10 miles that way. Now it rained the day before, the rivers are swollen, the territory between here and where they are at a place called Wavre is quite broken, so it's going to take the Prussian army quite a long time to do that march. Armies move very slowly. We can walk 10 miles in 3 or 4 hours, not a problem, but dragging guns, wagons, marching large bodies of men will take some time, so it's going to take a while for the Prussians to arrive. And both Napoleon and Wellington know that. So Napoleon has to beat Wellington before they can come. Wellington just has to hold on. So what is Napoleon's plan for this? Well, he surveys the terrain, he thinks of a few plans. First of all, he thinks, well, I could outflank Wellington that way. It'll cut him off from the Prussians, it'll push him away from the Brussels road, but then he decides, well, that will take too long. So in the end, he decides he's going to start the day with an attack on the farmhouse of Hougomont, which is over there. Picture farmhouse, nice orchard, large woodland outside, very nice place, which is garrisoned by Wellington's troops. So he'll attack that to start, and when Wellington is distracted with that, he will launch a hammer blow from his right into Wellington's centre left, smashing Wellington's lines, taking the road that will lead back to Brussels, cutting Wellington off from there, cutting him off from his allies, and then hopefully destroying Wellington's army. This is Napoleon's idea. It's not particularly subtle, but it might work. And he's going to support this attack with a massive battery of guns, between 60 and 80 cannon, arrayed along his ridgeline, that will batter the Allied lines, creating holes, creating chaos, creating panic, allowing his infantry to go through. So that is the plan for the day. But it will start off, like I mentioned, with the attack on Hougomont, which is garrisoned by?
So a mixture of troops again, light companies from the British Foot Guards battalions, but also a battalion of Nassau riflemen, light infantry, and a couple of companies of Hanoverians outside as well. So they're ready for the attack that they know is likely to come. They've loopholed the building and some of the walls the night before, unlike the other bastion that we'll come to later on. So they're ready for whatever the French are going to throw at them.
And what the French is going to throw at them to start with is a brigade of infantry. So several thousand men march towards Hougomont, but between them and the farmhouse chateau is a small woodland, and it takes them about an hour to fight their way through this woodland. The Nassauers holding it put up some stiff resistance, and the French find it hard going. And then when eventually they clear the Nassauers from the woodland and come up against the walls of the chateau, as Michael said, they find loopholes, they find the guards ensconced, and they can't get their way in. The general leading the attack, General Baudouin, gets himself killed, which someone put to downer on the day for him, but also his brigade, who then lose heart. So another brigade is thrown in. And suddenly this diversionary attack that Napoleon wanted to draw Wellington's attention is starting to draw more troops than Napoleon had wanted. But it has done its job to an extent. He started the battle there, and he has got Wellington maybe a little concerned about what's going on Wellington's right. Is Wellington concerned?
He certainly was concerned, because throughout the campaign and even throughout the day of Waterloo, Wellington was always looking to his right flank. He was expecting Napoleon to maneuver around that side, even though that might have pushed him towards the Prussians, but it would have cut his line of communications if the French had gone right the way round. So he was always concerned about that possibility, and he had a lot of reinforcements, that's Wellington, off to his right at Braine-l'Alleud, and even further at a place called Howell, and the troops there didn't take any part in the battle at Waterloo. He was so concerned about it.
So Napoleon has judged correctly that Wellington has some concerns on that side, and now thinks, well, the time is ripe to launch this attack, this hammer blow against Wellington's centre left and smash through. And for that, he is going to use First Corps, which is the biggest single formation he's got with his army. It's also the only one that hadn't been engaged on the 16th in those two battles of Quatre Bras and Ligny. It has spent the day kind of marching between them. So the men are a bit fresher. And this is between 18 and 20,000 men who are going to be launched in huge columns on a frontage of less than a mile against Wellington's line. Now these columns are an unusual formation. For whatever reason, the French depart from their normal doctrine, and in this case they create columns where a battalion lines up in 3 ranks and forms the first part of the column, and then the other battalions of the division line up behind them. So there's 8 columns stacked deep, or 8 battalions stacked deep in a big column formation. So it's about 24 ranks deep and 150 to 200 men wide. We call them columns. They're actually wider than they are deep, maybe 120 meters wide, 80 meters deep. Now, these are massive formations. And when they start to advance, the Allied artillery on the ridge sees a huge target and opens up on them. And what happens for the next 15 minutes is the French troops marching into a storm of shell as they cross the battlefield. And this is the first major attack of the day. The Allies start to concentrate everything they've got on their centre left against what the French are bringing forward. This is going in an echelon formation. So 1st Division here marches first. 5 minutes later, 2nd Division here starts off. So they're going to kind of hit like waves on a shore breaking against the Allied lines. And the idea here is basically it allows reinforcements to come in without having to go in through the men already in action. So 1st Division advancing, taking fire, taking casualties, but not losing heart. The memoirs of men in 1st Division say that they marched forward singing and chanting, shouting. Now, of course, this gives them courage. This makes them want to carry on. But they are taking brutal punishment. They get near this bastion in the centre that Michael's already mentioned, La Haye-Sainte, a farmhouse. Not much exciting about the farmhouse, and actually not very well defended, because the day before they realised they'd have to defend it, some of the Allied troops had smashed down the main doors of the barn and burnt them for firewood. So there's no doors to protect this farmhouse. And the French tried to attack this. The German garrison, King's German Legion soldiers, hold on. There's a brutal fight for that. But the rest of 1st Division marches on for the ridgeline. 2nd Division just behind them. 3rd Division a bit further off, 5 minutes behind them. Holding the ridgeline is a single brigade. Now this brigade is outnumbered about 8 to 1 in this engagement. And as you'd imagine, they start to give ground. It's a Dutch-Belgian brigade. They're often said to have kind of fled at the first shots. The British like to make fun of them, but actually they held pretty well. But eventually they are pushed back and start to withdraw. So to plug this gap, the reserve is brought up. And the reserve are 2 British brigades, one under Kempt, who are ordered to charge against the 1st French Division. So they advance forward at the double to the small sunken lane on top of the ridgeline, fire a volley, and then charge over this ridge and hit French 1st Division just as they arrive. Now this brigade itself was outnumbered quite heavily, but the shock of them suddenly appearing, firing a volley and hitting the French pushes the French 1st Division back down the slope. It's not a rout, but the French do withdraw. 2nd Division, marching on just after them, is equally halted by this infantry attack. But 3rd Division, they keep on coming. And Kempt's brigade isn't big enough to cover that, so another brigade is brought up to face 3rd Division. And this is Pack's brigade. They've been heavily involved at Quatre Bras 2 days before. A quarter of their men had been killed and wounded at Quatre Bras, including the commanders of 3 of their battalions. They had taken a bit of a pasting there. And they're thrown back into action now on the 18th. And they advance against this column that outnumbers them significantly. They put up resistance, the 92nd Highlanders especially, but numbers begin to tell and the Highlanders begin to get pushed back. Now there is no infantry on the Allied side behind them. Kempt's men, Pack's men, they are the last men infantry in this line. There are some Hanoverians to their flank who can't move because they're in square. And to make things worse, Kempt's men have been outflanked by a French cavalry brigade just the other side of the road. Things are looking pretty dicey for the Allies, and Napoleon, he's about to win this battle.
It's looking pretty poor at this juncture, and either by good luck if you're Napoleon or bad luck if you're Wellington, the attack was going in against these brigades, which had, as Graeme mentioned, been severely weakened 2 days before at Quatre Bras. Not only Pack's brigade, but also Kempt's to a lesser extent, and also the Dutch-Belgian brigade, who were in the front line, had been really heavily engaged at Quatre Bras. So added to the fact that Wellington, as we'd said earlier, was looking to his right rather than his left, and maybe he'd hoped that the Prussians would have been arriving round about this time, the first troops. In that he was going to be sadly disillusioned because they wouldn't be able to get there for another few hours. But this meant that his infantry resources were very weak in that left centre part of his line. So what could he do? Well, luckily, between himself and his commander of cavalry, Lord Uxbridge, they brought up 2 brigades of British heavy cavalry from reserve and saw that this was the ideal moment to send back the French infantry and hopefully catch them unawares before they get a chance to form square, the normal defence against cavalry, and throw them off the ridge line. So these 2 brigades, the Household Brigade on the Wellington's right and the Union Brigade on the left, start to move forward. They wouldn't have been able to charge headlong because of the conditions of the ground, because of having to get through their own infantry units. But as they get towards the top of the gentle slope on the reverse side of the ridge, the French infantry are there. Some of them, we're not quite sure probably exactly how far forward the French had penetrated by that time, but some had certainly crossed the narrow lane with its hedges along the ridge of Wellington's position, and others perhaps were still coming up the slope. But these 2 brigades of heavy cavalry see this ideal target and they quicken their pace and they get in among them. The Household Brigade on the right have to fight off some French cavalry first before they can hit infantry targets, but the Union Brigade on the left are able to go straight into those French infantry, who, to all intents and purposes, are pretty defenceless against heavy cavalry units moving at speed, and they are broken up as those cavalry regiments get in among them, helped, of course, by the infantry who are still able to carry on and fight. They move through the French cavalry and also go on, as was their wont of the British cavalry. Some of the units, in particular the 2nd Royal North British, the Scots Greys, had actually fought during the Peninsular War, and they were very difficult to control, and so they go herring on, perhaps as if in a fox hunt, towards the French guns beyond.
So our scene is now one of, as one witness called it, vehement destruction in the valley. From 4 divisions of infantry, 3 of them are now streaming back in disorder. 1 hasn't actually been attacked too badly, so kind of keeps its cohesion, but they're out of the fight. So French troops running back, the British cavalry chasing them, and the British cavalry, as Michael mentioned, kind of get out of control and keep charging. And so Napoleon decides on a counterstroke. He brings forward a brigade of his heaviest cavalry, the cuirassiers, to the front, and he sends some light cavalry round to the side. Basically, it's going to crush these British horsemen. And this counterstroke pretty much works. The British horses are tired. Their riders, exhilarated by their victory, don't see the danger coming, and the French sweep in. And the British heavy cavalry, having destroyed the French infantry attack, are themselves in turn destroyed. There is then a British countercharge against the French cavalry and a Belgian countercharge. So we have a charge, a countercharge, then a countercharge, and then a French countercharge. Don't know what counters are up to, but anyway, they melee around for a while, and then eventually artillery on both sides start firing into the melee, and the cavalry both withdraw. So this first major attack of the day has been a total catastrophe for the French. Their infantry has been broken. They're not totally wiped out. Many of them will rally and fight later in the day, but they've been broken. They've taken really heavy casualties, and their cavalry has had to be thrown in, and they've gained nothing. Wellington has held his ridgeline. And the problem that the French now face is that this was their main infantry force. They have 1 division left on the far side of the road. The rest of them are engaged at Hougoumont. They've got some reserves, but with rumours of the Prussians somewhere over there, they need to keep reserves. So they have no more infantry to spare. Now the battle calms down for half an hour maybe at this stage, until basically the French need to do something, and Napoleon decides he is going to probe the Allied line on the other side. So you now get some action over there. You're going to get an attack with his cavalry. And the rationale for this is disputed, but the thinking is basically Marshal Ney sees some Allied troops on this side of the battlefield moving back, and he thinks, well, they might be breaking. If I throw in some cavalry, maybe that will smash them up. Maybe we'll win the battle this way. So he throws in a brigade of cavalry. But the orders get a bit mangled, and the brigade becomes a division, then another division joins in, and then he brings in some more cavalry to try to support them. And so by about 3:30, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, most of the French cavalry is hurling itself at that side of the Allied lines, trying to smash the infantry.
And the infantry are able to do what the French infantry were not able to do, because the Allied infantry have more time. They see this cavalry coming, and so they form square. Each battalion, or in some cases 2 battalions combined, form probably 20 squares along that right-hand section of Wellington's Ridge. And they will prove to be breakwaters against this French cavalry attack as they come up, and against a formed square bristling with bayonets and the rear ranks firing muskets, there's very little the cavalry can do. However brave they are, however many times they charge, and of course with each successive charge they get less well formed, they get more tired, and suffer more casualties. And added to that, Wellington is able to bring up light cavalry reserves to countercharge the French, to just help the infantry squares in fighting off the cavalry, who in the end have little choice but to retreat back to their own lines.
So we're now in the mid-afternoon. The infantry attack has failed on this side, the cavalry attack has failed on this side, and both sides have suffered significant casualties. I'm sure some of you are suffering in the heat as well. So we're going to break there for our first part, and we'll come back in a bit to finish off the narrative of the battle. But thank you all very much for your patience and for suffering with the heat.
So we're mid-afternoon at Waterloo, something like 4 o'clock. The French cavalry had given up with their attacks. They weren't able to find a way through. And so there's one of these little lulls in the fighting, although the artillery continues to fire from both sides. But I'm sure you're all asking, what's happened to those Prussians? We left them way off that side, marching towards the battlefield in it was very bad conditions, as we heard, narrow lanes, muddy lanes, streams to cross. It was a difficult march for them, especially bearing in mind that they had fought a major battle 2 days previously and retreated from that in disorder and had to reform, regroup, and then start their march to Waterloo. But they were coming. Not just the one corps that Wellington was expecting, but in fact 3 corps were sent to Wellington's aid, because their 4th corps was still in Wavre, and they were fending off the eventual attack from the French flanking force that had been sent off to try and stop them ever combining with Wellington. So the Prussians were coming. Wellington had hoped that they might arrive about 11 o'clock in the morning, and that might have been why his lines on the left were relatively weak, as we saw when D'Erlon's infantry went in. But it was about 1:30, we think, that the Prussians are first sighted emerging from the woods way off on that side of the battlefield. And those troops are initially under von Bülow, the 4th Corps of the Prussian army, and we're talking about 20,000 men in each corps, so they're strong units of men. And although they're sighted, Bülow quite rightly wants to make sure that he gets enough troops up, ready to fight, and in order, in good order, before he commits them to the battle. So although they're sighted, they aren't actually committed to the fight immediately. So we know they're coming, but do the French know that they're arriving?
Well, Napoleon does claim to have seen the Prussians. In his later accounts of the battle, he says about 1:30 in the afternoon, he looks off to his right and sees a distant smudge on the horizon. And his staff officers want to know what it is, but Napoleon, being Napoleon, of course, says, well, I know what that is, that's the Prussians, and we now need to get a move on. So already in the early afternoon, he's noticed that they're arriving, but he knows how long it'll take them to get from the heights where he can see them to the battlefield, 2 or 3 hours. He thinks that's enough to break Wellington. But he does take precautions. 6th Corps, which is his only reserve infantry corps, he sends off to his right flank. They're going to guard against this Prussian arrival. But fundamentally, he's going to try to ignore them and break Wellington first in the center and then turn on the Prussians. So his plan for breaking Wellington in the center, well, he's tried a couple of things. He's attacked down his right. He's attacked with the cavalry on the left. But now he decides, well, let's do this properly. Let's take the outlying positions of Wellington's army. Let's get artillery right up close to them and let's blast them to pieces, make a hole and break their army. And the first place he wants to try to take is the farmhouse right in the center of Wellington's line, La Haye-Sainte. They attacked it earlier in the day with a brigade of 1st Division during d'Erlon's major attack, that huge attack that went in, but that had failed. So then he decides in the middle of the afternoon he's going to attack it again. So he tells one of the divisions that was less badly beaten from d'Erlon's attack to go and attack this farmhouse again. But the farmhouse is well defended.
It was indeed. It's defended by one of the crack King's German Legion light battalions who are armed with the Baker rifle, the same weapon that the British 95th and 60th Rifles had. So they were well trained, they were very effective men in terms of holding this sort of position. The problem was, or two main problems. One, that the night before, as we'd said in our previous talk, they hadn't really defended, loopholed, barricaded the position as well as Hougoumont had been defended. In fact, the tools needed for this job were sent from their unit over to Hougoumont to help them defend that better. So that was a problem. The barn door, this massive barn door wooden defence, which could have been a useful barricade against attacks, had been taken down quite understandably and chopped up and used for firewood during that miserable night before the battle. And so it wasn't such a good position to fight off the French attacks. The other problem as the day wore on was that this advantage that they had initially by being armed by the accurate Baker rifle is that their ammunition, when it started to run low, is understandable because they were right in the middle of the battlefield. They had lots of targets to fire at during the course of the day, but they needed resupply. And for some reason, it doesn't appear that they were resupplied with the specific ammunition that they needed for their rifles. One account says that it's possible the wagon was overturned back on the road towards Brussels, and so that was a problem. But we don't hear of problems for the 95th Rifles, one unit of which was only just outside the farmhouse for most of the battle, in terms of their being resupplied. So we don't quite know what happened there, but by 6 o'clock, the King's German Legion were on the point of having to rifle through, pardon the pun, their dead comrades or wounded comrades' cartridge pouches to get ammunition to the defenders. This was a big problem as the French come in with this new attack.
So 2nd Division advance against this farmhouse in the centre. At the same time, we have another French division advancing to the farmhouses that were mentioned right at the start on the far left of the Allied lines, the right of the French, which are held by some Nassauers. These are German troops, but they're actually fighting under the King of the Netherlands, just to show how multinational armies were of the period. But they're under pressure. Hougoumont, off on that side, is now on fire. You can see the flames coming out of our imaginary Hougoumont. That's on fire, being attacked by the French, and now this farmhouse in the centre is under significant attack by a full French division with its engineers. And its engineers, crucially, have big axes, and one of the engineer officers wallops down the main gate, and then it's game over. The German defenders have pretty much run out of ammunition. They try to defend themselves with the bayonet, but they are overrun and forced out. A counterattack by some more King's German Legion comes swooping down, but French cavalry intercept it and massacre the battalion. So the farmhouse in the centre is lost, and Napoleon loses no time in bringing up some guns, situating them just outside this farmhouse, and from less than a quarter of a mile, he can now pound the Allied centre. And so Wellington knows that something needs to be done here because his army is risking being fractured. Now, fortunately for Wellington, something else is happening on the battlefield, which is that von Bülow's Prussians, who've arrived on this side, have now started to come out of the woodland and towards a small village called Plancenoit, which is about a mile that way. A lovely little village, nice square, church, lovely place. And they're starting to advance towards that, which starts to distract Napoleon's attention. So Napoleon, having already sent 2 divisions over there to defend it, orders them to defend this village of Plancenoit, but they're outnumbered. They're outnumbered about 3-1 by the Prussians. They put up a staunch defense, but they're pushed back. They try to defend the village, and especially the churchyard, big, thick stone walls, an established part of the centre of the village, but the Prussian assault is ferocious, and it turfs them out. The French counterattack, but the Prussians come back. And a vicious fight for this village of Plancenoit is going on down there, just as Wellington's centre is being pummeled by French artillery just by the farmhouse. So the battle is very much developing by this stage. But the Prussians under von Bülow aren't the only Prussians arriving at the battlefield.
No, indeed. So we said there were 3 corps on their way. That is one of them, Bülow's 4th Corps. But there was also under Zieten, his 1st Corps. They'd been coming towards the battlefield. And as they came in sight of it, it seems that they thought Wellington was about to be beaten, that his troops were starting to move to the rear. Perhaps they'd seen people carrying wounded and that sort of thing going back to Mont Saint-Jean. But for whatever reason, his course changed direction. So instead of joining Wellington's left flank, they started a swing towards Plancenoit, where they would help von Bülow assault that and cut Napoleon's communications, hopefully. Even if Wellington was beaten, there was still a good chance they might win. However, at a crucial moment, a Prussian staff officer called von Muffling arrived, and he was the liaison officer attached to Wellington, who had gone out in search of the Prussian reinforcements, found Zieten's corps, and persuaded them that, in fact, Wellington was not beaten. He just needed reinforcements now. And so they moved again, and they had time to do this, fortunately, to swing back towards the north and to join Wellington's lines around these bastions at Papelotte and La Haye on Wellington's left. It did involve some unfortunate, what we'd call blue-on-blue incidents, as the Nassers defending there were wearing uniforms which were the same silhouette as the French uniforms. Indeed, a lot of the men had actually fought in the French armies before 1814. But that was sorted out, and the arrival of Zieten's troops shored up Wellington's left and allowed him to move some more troops who had been holding that part of the line to the centre. And that breathing space, while Plancenoit was being attacked and Napoleon's gaze was being diverted, sorry, it's a bit like the Sauron's eye in Lord of the Rings, isn't it? Sort of diverted to that part of the battlefield, allowed Wellington to move troops around, to bring some in from his right to shore up the centre. But things were still happening in Plancenoit.
Yeah, so in Plancenoit, we've had this back and forth, the French trying to hold the village, the Prussians turfing them out, French counterattacking and the Prussians attacking again. And Napoleon realizes that if he's to hold his right flank, Plancenoit is the only bastion he can use. Once he's lost that, his flank is open, his army will probably be destroyed, caught between Wellington and Blucher. So he sends reinforcements, and he decides to send the Imperial Guard, the best of the best soldiers in the best army of Europe, as Napoleon would see it. I'm sure Wellington would differ. But the Imperial Guard, 8 battalions of young guardsmen, are sent down under General Duhem to storm this village. And they storm in with the bayonet, and they turf out the Prussians. More than double their number are pushed back by this impetuous attack of the young guard. General Duhem himself is badly wounded in the proceedings. But the young guard is not strong enough to hold on, because the Prussians come back. These might be young troops, they might be Landwehr, essentially militia, but they fight with incredible ferocity, and they push the French out again. So Napoleon rolls his last dice. The old guard, the best of the best of the best of the French army, 2.5 battalions of old guardsmen are sent down, and they charge in with the remains of the young guard, with the remains of 6 Corps supporting them, and they finally turf the Prussians out once again. Through sheer force of personality, through sheer intimidation, plus their fighting abilities, they throw out a far larger Prussian force. Now the Prussians are still there, so it's not that Napoleon can ignore this, but he's held Plancenoit, and he's held it for just long enough to have one more crack at Wellington. Now by this stage, Napoleon must have a great deal of respect for Wellington's tenacity. He's thrown everything at him: artillery, infantry, cavalry. He's tried to maneuver him, he's tried to batter him, but Wellington has not shifted from his ridge. So what can Napoleon do? He has 10 battalions left of Imperial Guardsmen. Just 10 battalions, but they are his best troops, and so he decides to roll the dice one last time. If he can beat Wellington, he can then turn his army and see off the Prussians. That's his only chance. He can't disengage from Wellington and face the Prussians with his whole force, because Wellington will attack him. The only thing he can do is try to beat Wellington, and Wellington has now concentrated his army all the way over here, on this kind of right-hand side, the French left, and so that's where the attack goes in. 10 battalions of Imperial Guardsmen marching across the valley. Now they split into 3 groups, more or less, and hit in 3 waves. Each of them attacking with the bayonet, firing a volley, and then trying to charge the Allied infantry. And the Allied infantry has suffered all day from bombardment, from cavalry attack, from skirmishers sniping at them. They've been whittled down. They're exhausted, running low on ammunition. Are they going to hold?
A good question. We will see. Fortunately, though, that breathing space that Wellington had, provided by the Prussians' attacks at Plancenoit, meant that he was able to bring fresh reserves in to help shore up his line. So the orders went out to those troops at Braine-l'Alleud to come over to help shore up. That was a division of Dutch-Belgian troops. Some batteries of guns were brought up. Some fresher Allied reserves were also brought into the front line. Cavalry were brought across from the left flank to that position where the Guard were going to attack. So Wellington had done what he could to shore up his line as that first wave of the Guard came in. But elements of his line were still very weak. As Graeme had said, they'd fought throughout the day, they'd been whittled down. Some of the troops were not that experienced, and that includes some of the British units, were fresh. They hadn't been in the Peninsular War, whereas others were veterans. So it was a real mixed bag of Allied units that the French were going to attack. Do you want to mention the first wave?
Well, I'll mention it all kind of as one wave. Just one thing to mention on the French side. These battalions going in are the Imperial Guard. They are meant to be the very best, but the Imperial Guard had been abolished when Napoleon had been overthrown the previous year, and they've been formed really quickly in 1815. So these battalions going in, although they are all veterans, although they've all fought many campaigns, they haven't been together very long. Their cohesion isn't brilliant. So they're maybe not as intimidating when the going gets tough as they seem to start with, and that might help in what comes next. But the Guard launched themselves forward to the Allied lines. We haven't got long left, so we'll condense this down, but they hit more or less in 3 waves and are met by different units of the Allied line. you want to talk us through that?
Yeah, so moving from the central Wellington's line over towards the right, firstly, the initial Guard attack has some success against Colin Halkett's brigade and some Brunswick battalions. But they rally and are saved, probably, by the arrival of those Dutch-Belgian troops under their divisional commander Chassé and Detmer's brigade, who charge in, even though they're militia battalions, at a crucial moment, along with an artillery battery that was fresh, which shot away the head of that column. Moving along a bit further, more battalions of the Guard came up against British Guards, British Foot Guards, who weren't down in Hougoumont. And the two battalions of the mustn't use that word yet, the 1st Foot Guards, were there to, who hadn't been heavily involved in the battle to this point, other than forming the squares against the cavalry, were able to shoot volleys at the French Guards as they arrived. It seems likely that they saw off the first wave, but as they advanced down the slope, it's possible that they were discomfited by a second wave of French Guardsmen and started to fall back, possibly in disorder. We're not quite sure what happens at that point. But Adams' British brigade, a light brigade, including a large battalion, the 52nd Light Infantry under Sir John Colborne, take an unorthodox step at that point, and they swing out from the British lines, they wheel forwards, and that's pretty unorthodox because had there been French heavy cavalry, or any cavalry lurking, they could have swept up Colborne's battalions in the flank, but they didn't, and so Colborne's battalions were able to flank the middle guard and fire at them and then charge into their flank. So that's it's quite confused, but that's a summary of what happened in terms of defence.
Yeah, trying to find out exactly what happened in this moment is always confusing because, of course, every single soldier on the battlefield was the one that beat the Guard. Everyone claims to have been involved and to have been the one that really won it. But this is an Allied effort very much. Every nationality represented in Wellington's army is there at the climax, pushing back the Guard, and the Guard breaks. They don't just start to withdraw slowly, they do break and they are pushed down the slope. And at the same time, this is within minutes, the French troops over in Plancenoit also are pushed out. Another Prussian attack with overwhelming force pushes them out of that village, and they fall back in relatively good order, but they are falling back. And the French army is now being crushed between these two forces. Wellington, a consummate general, sees his moment and launches a counterattack across his line. Adams' brigade sweeps across the battlefield. They retake La Haye-Sainte with barely a shot being fired. The French more or less abandon it, and French troops across the field begin to fall back. To start with, it's orderly, and then it's less orderly. And then eventually, when they see the firing from the Prussians, when they see Wellington's forces coming from over there and Zieten from over here, the French army dissolves more or less into a mass and begins to flee southwards. A few battalions hold their nerve and stay. 2 battalions of Imperial Guardsmen who have not yet been committed, Napoleon's final reserve, they hold the road and try to prevent a pursuit and allow the army to escape, but the French army is running. Now this is bad enough, but when they get a few miles south to a place called Genappe, where there's a narrow bridge across a river, at that point they totally dissolve. The bridge gets blocked almost immediately by wagons and guns, nothing else can get across, and men break into small parties and break apart entirely. And so by about 10, 11 in the evening on the day of Waterloo, a day that Wellington had almost lost several times, but had always held on, by about 11 o'clock, the French army is destroyed, Napoleon is beaten, and the rest, as they say, is history.
Now, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce Dr. Zack White. Dr. Zack White is going to talk to you now about the exciting and fun subject of discipline in Wellington's army. Over to you, Zack.
Apsley House, good afternoon. I've never done a talk under armed guard before, so there's a first time for everything. In July 1813, the then Earl Wellington wrote to the Secretary of State for War and the Colonies, the Earl of Bathurst, stating that it was, and I quote, "quite impossible for me or any other man to command the British Army under the existing system. We have in the service the scum of the earth as common soldiers." That is perhaps one of the most infamous quotes on the calibre of the soldiers who would fight at Waterloo. And ever since, it is perhaps one of the most misunderstood comments. Some of Wellington's fans have tried to explain it away, suggesting that perhaps he didn't really mean it. Well, he repeated it on 4 separate occasions, so I think he probably did. Others have suggested that perhaps he was having a bit of a bad day. He was quite stressed. He'd just won the Battle of Victoria. These things happen, you know, a bit of the equivalent of sort of sending an email when you're a little bit too narky, and off goes that letter, and perhaps it doesn't really reflect Wellington's psyche. The reality is that Wellington's comment was part of a long-standing campaign, a campaign to change the fabric of how he could discipline his troops. Wellington wanted to ride roughshod over the law, and whilst it's unfashionable to denigrate an individual in what is fundamentally their own house, I'm afraid that's exactly what I'm tasked with to doing this afternoon when talking you through discipline in this army. But what was this system? Why does it matter? And what was it that Wellington thought was fundamentally wrong about it? Well, for Wellington, he wanted essentially to be able to punish more. For him, the military justice system was simply not working in the way that he wanted. Now, the military justice system was a complex one. It was fundamentally split into 3 different tiers of military court. At the top, you had the general courts martial, the most senior of the military courts, the most powerful. This was the only court that could try officers. Every other court was capable of trying, all of the courts, in fact, were capable of trying soldiers of all ranks, but only the general courts martial could punish officers. And they tried the most serious of the offences. I'm talking about desertion. I'm talking about murder, mutiny, and in the most in occasional instances, things like looting and plundering. They could also hand out the heftiest punishments. Execution was within the remit of these courts. Transportation overseas to New South Wales was also a common punishment handed down. But they could also hand down floggings. Legally, anything up to 1,500 lashes in a single punishment. Now, the reality is that that punishment was only handed out 3 times, and it was never inflicted in full. I've been over 11,500 cases over the course of the Napoleonic Wars as part of my research, and actually the most commonly used punishments from the general courts martial when it came to flogging are 1,000 to 1,200 lashes, which was then often commuted down, so soldiers would be essentially let off part of their punishment for good behaviour. Folks often ask, is that enough to kill an individual? The simple answer is no. A medical officer was required to attend every single flogging with the expectation that they would intervene if they deemed that the recipient had had too much punishment. And quite often what would happen is the individual would then be taken down and the remainder of the punishment would be forgiven. The army, remember, had the facility to execute its men. Flogging was not an elaborate way of executing them. And therefore, when historians like Roger Norman Buckley have talked about terror and torture as public spectacle being the mainstay of the British justice system, they have missed a fundamental point. There is a difference between what the law looks like in theory and the reality of how it's implemented on the ground. The other 2 tiers of court are stopgaps. You have the regimental courts martial at the bottom. As the name suggests, they are fundamentally internal military courts. They are within the regiment, staffed by regimental officers, and they have a much lower threshold in terms of what they can issue in terms of punishments. So initially, floggings are limited to 500 lashes, and then the Commander-in-Chief, the Duke of York, stipulates that this is too much and unilaterally reduces it down to 300. Still a very painful day at the office if you're on the receiving end. And in the middle, you have a stopgap, a fudge to try and solve the fact that there are lots of people being tried at regimental courts martial for crimes that merit slightly more severe punishment. So I'm talking about more minor cases of desertion, perhaps a shorter period of time when you're away from the unit, and also cases of drunkenness. The general regimental courts martial is brought in 1812 to try and plug that gap. It's essentially meant to be a means of punishing soldiers better and more appropriately for their crimes. In reality, the scale of the adoption indicates that it's simply used to punish soldiers more. But there is a dilemma for the officers who capture their men literally in the act, particularly if they are found plundering. And this gives rise to a system of military justice that is far less terror and torture and far more about pragmatism and discretion. Officers face a choice day by day. They live with these men. They eat beside these men. They will stand and die beside these men on the battlefield. And if you beat these men into submission, there is a very good chance that when the battle starts and the bullets begin to fly, you don't so much need to worry about the French bullets flying at you as what the guys behind you, who you have sadistically beaten time and time again, might choose to do with the musket that you just ordered them to load. It's a phenomenon known as fragging, and officers were acutely aware that this was, firstly, a possibility, but also that if you wanted the best out of your men, you can't beat them into giving their best. You can't beat people to stand and face impossible odds like you've just heard from Graeme and Michael on the fields of Waterloo. As a result, officers would often intervene very early in floggings, stating that they believed that the individual had had enough, superseding the judgment of the medical officials standing and observing the punishments. We also see instances where officers would simply ignore crimes, literally turning a blind eye, particularly to plunder. Why plunder of all crimes? Surely it's bad business for soldiers to be marching into a landscape when you're trying to liberate the locals, particularly during the Peninsular War, from French control, only for your own men to then start stealing from those very civilians you're liberating. The answer comes down to food supplies, as it so often does in war. Logistics wins wars. And whilst Wellington was a master of logistics, and whilst the men were unquestionably as well fed as the circumstances allowed at any point when they were under his command, it was nonetheless the case that two things were happening. Firstly, rations regularly did not get through. And on multiple occasions, soldiers went without eating. That therefore meant they were going hungry and they needed to supplement their rations. But even if they got their full ration, it wouldn't have been enough. Nutritional analysis of the rations that these guys were receiving compared to the calorific burns that we know they would have endured through the weight of equipment they were carrying and the lengths of their marches shows that they were starving on the food that the army gave them. Put another way, the calorific burn did not equal the calorific intake, which meant that these men faced a dilemma. They could follow military law and starve in the process, or they could break military law, plunder, risk the punishments, but at least live long enough to be able to receive that punishment. Now, the officers were not idiots. They see the privations the men endure day by day. They share those privations in many instances. And as a result, they are inclined to turn that blind eye, or even in some cases actively encourage plunder, for two reasons. Firstly, if somebody's well fed, they're less grumpy, they're more compliant. And there is no point in beating these individuals if you know that they are starving. But equally, the officers are in on the game. They get a cut of the plunder. And we have some incredible accounts from memoirs of officers berating their men in one moment for the fact that they might have plundered a mill, only for them to have their moral high ground, shall we say, cut out from underneath them as a chicken pokes its head out of the pocket of their coat. The soldiers themselves also know how to play this system. And I think it's really important that we think about soldiers as active participants in their journey through the military justice system rather than passive passengers. These men might not have been educated, they might not have been able to engage in very loquacious defences, but nonetheless, they knew how this system worked. They knew how officers' minds worked. They knew that if they were well behaved, they could plead their case, either in the court by bringing an officer to testify to their good character, or on the tripod about to receive a flogging. The most evocative instance of this is a soldier who is about to be flogged for plunder by none other than Black Bob Crawford, most famously one of the strictest disciplinarians in the entirety of Wellington's army during the Peninsular War. At this point, the soldier turns around and appeals directly to the Brigadier General. No small feat if you are simply a private. And he turns to Bob and he says, "Do you remember the time when we've been captured in Buenos Aires? And I shared the last of our biscuit because we weren't being fed. You know how much we've been struggling in terms of supplies." It's a very emotional pitch. It's unlikely to work most of the time for somebody as strict as Black Bob Crawford. But on this occasion, it works. And Crawford breaks down in tears. One of the few occasions where we see the veneer of this incredibly strict individual actually break in the face of reality. The other way in which the military justice system was in no way as strict as we might initially imagine off the base of the stipulations of military law, is to look at the way that the courts actually worked. It is, of course, always feasible for an individual to acknowledge that the game is up, that they've been caught red-handed, either having deserted or having stolen, and to therefore plead guilty. Now, in the modern legal system, as we all know, that can result in a reduced sentence. In the 18th century and the 19th century, that facility did not exist, certainly not during the Napoleonic Wars. And so, therefore, something really quite remarkable happened. The military courts refused to accept guilty pleas wherever possible. We know from trial transcripts that they turned around to those who pled guilty and said, "Are you sure? Because if you plead guilty, we have to proceed straight to sentencing. If you plead guilty, we can't hear any extenuating circumstances. We can't consider anything that might encourage us to reduce the scale of your sentence." And in some cases, even when soldiers insisted that they understood the risks and they were going to plead guilty regardless, the court quietly circumvented the usual legal process and heard the evidence anyway, just in case there was something that meant that the officers could judge a lower sentence was appropriate. It's also very striking that, surprisingly, for a period where mental health is not really acknowledged as an issue, mental health was taken quite seriously by military courts. There are cases where individuals plead that they are, quote, not in their right mind, and that therefore their actions are not reflective of them in their normal behavior, effectively trying to say, I understand the expectations of a good soldier, but something was different on that particular day, and I'm therefore trying to receive a little bit of clemency. This is a difficult defense to pull off, but interestingly, the military courts were prepared to hear it, and more than that, they were prepared to go out of their way to hear evidence to support it. In one instance, an individual pleads that he's not ordinarily in his right mind. He calls two witnesses, both of whom shrug their shoulders and go, I don't really know, I can't really comment on that. Sorry, it seems fine to me. So, unsurprisingly, the defendant turns and says, I have a third witness. I need this individual to be summoned. They can definitely testify to the fact that I am not always in, quote, my right mind. The entirety of the court procedure is stopped. The trial is placed on hold for days. The witness is summoned, brought before the court, and then asked to testify. It doesn't actually work out for the defendant because the witness turns around and says, I don't know who this guy is, so I can't help you. But nonetheless, the fact that the courts were willing to hear these kinds of defences speaks volumes about the degree to which they understand that the strains of war can really take their toll on the individual. Evidence was also key, and this, in some respects, is very much Wellington's problem. Leniency for good conduct was absolutely a mainstay of this system. If you could have an officer come and testify that you're a very good soldier, this is your first offence, that you drill incredibly well, that you're extremely well behaved, that could take hundreds of lashes off your sentence. Due process was also vital. All trials had to go for review, either by the regional commander of forces or, in many cases, right back here to London, where they were placed first before the Judge Advocate General, a lawyer employed by the British government to officiate and oversee the entire administration of military justice, and then, once they had been officiated by a legal expert, they were placed before the King or the Prince Regent, the military expert, a man with years of experience in overseeing these cases and judging what was or was not an appropriate punishment. This was not a capricious and arbitrary system. It was a pragmatic and discretionary one which soldiers could manipulate to their own ends, in some cases, albeit very rarely, even appealing to as high an authority as the King himself. So what then was Wellington's problem with this system? Well, his comments, as was the Duke's way, were quite trite. He lambasted the fact that they had become, quote, courts of evidence and were no longer courts of honour. Wellington was a man of the ancien regime. He was steeped in the aristocratic traditions. He was a man who was raised on the conflicts of the mid-18th century. And as a result, in that era where honour was so much more integral, the fact that there had been this shift, the evidence, the good legal practices that we now identify as so integral to legal process were becoming the mainstays of the justice system, this was intolerable to him because he wanted to be able to punish rapidly. He wanted the idea, the sense that a crime had happened and needed to be punished to be placed in a higher priority than actually gathering the witnesses. Why? Because quite often witnesses would not testify. You had to endure significant expense in order to get reimbursement for your stolen chickens. And this was a problem and a frustration for Wellington throughout the Peninsular War. He could place soldiers on trial, but if the civilians didn't come forward to testify to what had been taken, there wasn't a case. The case would collapse. And Wellington wanted to try and address this, to punish faster. He also didn't like the fact that at General Courts Martial, you had to summon 13 officers. That was a significant imposition on the administration of the army. He wanted to be able to punish much faster. And in 1809, he wrote a letter to the then Secretary of State for War, Castlereagh, asking for some significant changes. He wanted to be able to sign off on punishments immediately, and he wanted trials to be reduced in terms of the number of officers officiating to just 3 officers present. In 1813, just a couple of weeks before Bathurst was to receive that rant from Wellington, Bathurst sent Wellington a copy of an act that was about to be passed by Parliament. This act, according to Bathurst's own covering letter to the Duke, to the then Earl, had been amended according to your own requests. What did the act do? It created a new way of running general courts martials. Wellington, and Wellington alone, was empowered to call courts martial with just 3 officers. The sign-off would be the responsibility of the Duke himself. Wellington had effectively created his own law, his own style of military court that enabled him to achieve that process of punishing harder and faster. But for all of that, Wellington received a degree of pushback, not from the government, but from those creating facts on the ground. The king had already tried to push back on the scale of flogging. In 1807, he declared that he thought 1,500 lashes was far too much and that 1,000 was quite sufficient, which isn't much of a stay of execution, but nonetheless it's better than nothing. I've talked already about the Commander-in-Chief, the Duke of York, who writes a circular order that summarily decrees that regimental courts-martial will no longer be able to issue 500 lashes and instead reduce it down to 300. And then in Parliament, the Judge Advocate General, Charles Manners Sutton, goes entirely rogue. For reasons that nobody can entirely understand or fathom, he decides to institute a new form of punishment, solitary confinement, as an alternative to flogging. It's a move that is so unexpected that when he proposes it for the first time in Parliament, it's voted down. The next day, the opposition come out in numbers and call for this measure to be put again. Manners Sutton shrugs his shoulders, effectively says, yeah, sure, and the vote is passed. Now, the army takes a long time to try and work out what to do with it, but nonetheless, what you have is individuals dotted around the hierarchy of the military justice system, pulling in different directions. You have a military justice system that is effectively being pulled apart by all of these different pressures. So to conclude, why does all of this matter? For one thing, it's important to acknowledge the grim realities that were faced by the men who stood and fought at Waterloo. It also reminds us of the complexity of the human stories that underpin every single man who stood and fought against Napoleon. Why people decided to run and desert, why they stole, why they drank. Knowing all of this and how they justify breaking military law gives us a much more human perspective on the individual soldier who is so often pushed to the sidelines in favour of the actions of the big individuals. It also brings us to an astonishing realisation. Yes, the disciplinary system was flawed in so many ways, and yet somehow it worked just enough. It took incredible feats of the mind and of discipline to have just enough men standing at Waterloo to fend off Napoleon's advances. The military justice system was not perfect, but it did work just well enough to ensure that the Allies could win the Napoleonic Wars and the Battle of Waterloo. Thank you.
Dr. Lou Reynolds is an expert on the legacy of Waterloo, and he is author of Who Owns Waterloo? And I'm now going to hand him over to talk about what is Waterloo.
Quite literally. So thank you all for coming. Thank you all for being here, and thank you for staying through the heat. Thank you, for Matthew, and for making this possible. I have to give you a little bit of insight in the background. For me, talking about what I'm about to talk about in this room is the equivalent of a historian of the interwar years giving a lecture in the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles. It's that level of, oh, I get to be in the room where it happened. And we're going to be talking about the Waterloo Banquet, because you guys have had the battle. You've had Zack giving us lashings on discipline, and I think it's time for a bit of a party. So, in January of 1853, the second Duke of Wellington opened Apsley House to the general public for a day to commemorate his late father. And the Times, as it was its wont in this period, gave their readers a room-by-room description. They literally went around the building. And their description of this particular room, and I quote, "In the picture gallery, the annual Waterloo Banquet was held. And though it must be confessed for such a purpose, this long and narrow apartment was by no means well adapted," and the people at the ends of the room can vouch for that. "For upwards of 30 years did the Duke here assemble around him the chiefs with whom he fought his last battle. And here, as time rolled on, he found himself among the last of that distinguished band of his own fame. When the next of 18th June comes round, who will be worthy to preside over the surviving representatives of that army which had conquered Waterloo?" And the very simple answer was nobody. That had seen in 1852, in June 18th, 1852, Apsley House had seen the last Waterloo Banquet until June 18th, 2015. They recreated it for the bicentennial. There was plans, of course, to recreate it for the centennial in 1915, but something was going on in France and Belgium. It was weird, and we're not going to talk about it. But fundamentally, this was a moment that anchored Regency, post-Regency, late Georgian, and early Victorian life. It was held annually from 1821 until 1852. And it's one of those weird events where, as it happens and as it keeps going, the press coverage and the deal around it gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. The first banquet in 1821 has a couple of lines in a couple of newspapers. The Duke entertains some noble guests to celebrate the Battle of Waterloo. By the time we get to 1852, it's a column and a half in the Times, going through every single possible detail. This was a massive event, and it allowed Britain to anchor itself to Waterloo, to the Napoleonic Wars, as generations were born and grew up and were in the army and in the city and everywhere else that did not remember when Napoleon was anything but a name. Right? It allowed them to anchor themselves to that memory, and it allowed them to continue to justify celebrating Waterloo, celebrating the Napoleonic Wars, and crucially, justify Britain's place as the hegemon, the global superpower of the 19th century. Our boys died at Waterloo, and I'm aware of the irony of using that phrase, our boys, with this accent, but for this purpose it works. Our boys died at Waterloo, our blood was spilt, and therefore we gained the right to rule the world. So, it has always been, with one notable exception, in this building. From 1821 until 1828, it was held at the State Dining Room in the other end of the building, which I highly recommend you take a look at. But that was the original dining room of this house. This room is an addition. And it was in those rooms, as he was hosting them, that Wellington went, no, I want to throw bigger parties. I want bigger. And so he hired a couple of architects and eventually developed this space. So from 1821 to 1828, it was in the State Dining Rooms. In 1829, it's the one time it's not in this building, but it's in an address that you all know. He was Prime Minister, and he hosted it at 10 Downing Street. And funnily enough, given the panic that occasionally happens in this country around army control versus civilian control, there's no objections whatsoever. Because if anyone was going to hold the line on that, it was going to be the Duke of Wellington. And so they let him do it. And then from 1830 on, it is here, in this room. Fundamentally, where you are all seated is where it was. They set up this grand table that could seat up to 85 comfortably, and sometimes more than 100 a little bit more uncomfortably. And basically, fundamentally, what it was an all-male formal dinner with a guest list that exclusively comprised veteran officers of the battle. So I'm afraid our reenactors, with the exception of this gentleman here, are in fact apocryphal, because they wouldn't have allowed serving men in. They would have been out there with the band of the Grenadier Guards playing music, but in here was all officers. The notable exceptions to this was the reigning sovereign, except once Victoria came to the throne, at which point it was Prince Albert. Even Victoria didn't rate an invitation. And on occasion, one of the Duke's sons, one of his sons was a bishop, and was occasionally invited in to give a grace, or a reigning ambassador of an allied nation. That puts the theoretical guest list at 1,770. That is the number of officers who survived the Battle of Waterloo. And you can ask me how I know that later on, and I will tell you a tale of a very long Excel spreadsheet. Analysis of the guest lists for 19 banquets, we don't have all of them, shows that only 207 men ever received an invitation, slightly under 12%. And officers were not above cadging invitations. One of my favorite examples that I've ever found in an archive was a letter from a colonel of a Scottish regiment, he would have been a captain at Waterloo, to Wellington's secretary. And it literally is, it's that wonderful sort of, oh, I know exactly what you want, but I can't say it. So I happened to be in London on the 18th of June, and I just happened to have brought my dress uniform, and it happens to be clean in case there's an event happening. No response was ever delivered to that, but, sort of there was a delight for it. There was a yearning for this. To call these things sumptuous is to to understate it, right? You've all seen the painting in the next room, Salter's Waterloo Banquet, 1836, completed in 1840, and that very much sums it up. My favorite description of this event ever was from a reform paper, the Bristol Mercury, writing about it in a way that was trying to say, basically, we should not have these things. And they referred to it as a gold-plated military orgy, which is frankly unfair, because the dinner set is solid gold. It's not gold-plated. The Waterloo Gallery is specifically designed for grand entertainments and to mirror the great halls of Europe. This is Wellington having walked through Versailles, having walked through all of Vienna and gone, there's something to this home court advantage thing. I'm going to build that. And he basically took this room and went, I want to build a miniature Versailles on Hyde Park. The walls were originally yellow damask. Generally, it's agreed the red is a little better. But that was so controversial at the time that he got into a fight with his architect about it. The shutters to the windows were originally also mirrored to mirror Versailles' Hall of Mirrors. The paintings are anchored by 165 paintings from the Spanish Royal Collection that are rescued from the French baggage at Victoria and gifted to Waterloo by King Ferdinand of Spain in 1816. And I say gifted. Basically, a soldier found them in the baggage train at Victoria, delivered them to the Duke going, they're paintings. And he went, yeah, grand, send them to London. And then someone in London opened them and went, you have half the Spanish Royal Collection here. And he went, right. Wrote a letter to the King of Spain, and the King of Spain went, you know what, just keep them, it's fine. So it's sort of that somewhat looting, somewhat gift, etc. The table was laid where you guys are right now, and in fact, those two candelabras rather, not chandeliers, are 1.5 tons each of Russian marble, the gift of Alexander I, the Tsar of all the Russias. And because they're 1.5 tons each, they don't get moved for these banquets. And so the table was specifically designed to be built around them. If you look in the photographs, dear Lord, the painting in the next room, you will see they're in there and it looks almost like they're on the table. They're not. The table is clipped around them fundamentally. The service was either a gold service from the Duke of York, which is downstairs in the museum room, or a silver set from Don John, the King of Portugal. Some of that is downstairs, some of that is in the far end of the building. And the center of the table was occupied by a 27-foot long by 4-foot wide silver plateau decorated with over 100 trophies that was also the gift of the King of Portugal. If you're wondering, if you want to see that, and I highly recommend you do, in all its glory, it's in the state dining room on permanent display, and well worth a look around and an examination of it. Decoration was supplemented in later years by equestrian statues of Wellington and Napoleon, designed by Count d'Orsay, and 3 more gold candelabras with various military decorations. The final flourish from the table was the Dresden porcelain set, also downstairs, one of the last really great decorative china sets of the 19th century, a gift from the King of Prussia. So, on this table, we have Russian light, Prussian dessert, British gold and oak, and either Portuguese, Spanish, or British service. This table, fundamentally, is a physical embodiment of the Congress of Vienna. This is Wellington sitting there going, this is how we keep peace in Europe, and I am putting my entire weight behind this system. To make things better, of course, the sideboard and the buffet were good, solid English oak. And they were completely decorated with British decorations. The 1814 Wellington shield, which is also downstairs, often called the Waterloo shield, but inaccurately, it was actually given in 1814. The final scene on it is him receiving his dukedom, but gained so much attention that the cabinet downstairs that it's in is the original cabinet he had built for it. What you don't see anymore, it's now sealed off for obvious reasons, is that cabinet was built by a clockmaker, and it had a crank in it that allowed people to rotate it to see all the scenes as much as humanly possible. So definitely got attention. Supplemented by 2 more candelabras that are also downstairs, stylized as the Trees of Victory, and supported by the troops he led. So we have English Grenadiers, Scottish Highlanders, Irish Light Infantrymen. The only way you can tell he's an Irish Light Infantryman is you look at the flag that he's very much leaning against, and it's got the harp in the corner of it. A Portuguese civilian, an Indian sepoy, and a Spanish guerrilla. Given the level of guilt, of pomp, of circumstance, it's pretty reasonable to understand why the Times, the Mercury, everyone went, well, we got to write about this thing. And so press coverage increased and increased and increased, and everyone starts to want to be at this thing. Everyone wants to start to see it. And we have all sorts of letters to Wellington basically going, hey, can you turn this into an old school royal banquet of the type where the civilians could watch the king eat? And Wellington went, absolutely not. But what he did allow in the end is, once the table was set, he allowed people in to examine it. And so you could get a lithographed ticket from one of his secretaries, show up, and examine the table and see all the glory. For those who wanted a little bit more direct access, you would gather outside of Apsley House on the night, on Piccadilly. Usually they'd station about 5 to 10 constables out there to make sure traffic continued to flow down Piccadilly, but there were massive crowds. Some were there for entertainment, some were there for reflected glory, and some were jockeying for position. You all went through those gates down there. You know there's 2 of them. Most people were coming in from central London. So hang on, I noted this for a legitimate reason. The west side of the eastern gate. If you position yourself there, every general in an open-top carriage going in that gate makes eye contact with you. If you're sitting in the War Office and you're trying to get an appointment with Sir Hussey Vivian, and you know he's going to be there that night, you stand there and you wait for him to make contact with you, and then basically you say, I saw you last night, and now you have to see me, etc., etc. Guests were also not above jockeying. The papers tend to report who gets the loudest cheers from the crowd. John Byng, Alexander Fraser, Lord Saltoun, Sir Harry Smith were all popular, but the perennial favorites, and there are going to be names here that do not shock you, Sir Henry Harding, the Marquess of Anglesey, William IV, Prince Albert, and of course the Duke of Wellington himself, who emerged from the house to welcome the king or the prince consort. The crowd was entertained by the band of the Grenadier Guards, who played throughout, and then by the after-dinner speeches trickling through these windows, which at that point, rather sensibly, were open rather than sealed as they are today. The food was insane, but in no way a highlight. Not a single report gives a detail of the menu. Only one menu survives, thanks to Apsley House, who both preserved it and translated it, and the newspapers don't mention it. It's still, however, insane. 5 courses, supplemented by 3 different sets of 4 removes, and 2 side table services, for a grand total of 63 dishes. Yeah, constantly in and out. Also, because of the nationality of Wellington's French, but in one of the great, wonderful pieces of irony, the Waterloo Banquet's menu was always in French. The important thing fundamentally was being here, and being here for the toasts and the speeches. Because the toasts were in 2 parts. This is the way formal toasts are done. There is the actual toast, I give you the health of, and then there's a response, giving thanks. So 2 people spoke per speech. And it allowed Wellington to highlight the efforts of particular officers. So, the last toast, of course, was perennially to the Prussians. And he would use it to highlight Sir Henry Harding, who was the British representative to the Prussian force on June 18th, 1815. So, in order, the sovereign, then Prince Albert, and either the sovereign or Prince Albert would then give the Duke of Wellington. Wellington would then give, and this is always the same, it's a quote, the army that fought the Battle of Waterloo, and then in silence, the memory of those who fell. Following that, because this is Britain, in strict hierarchical order, the cavalry, the guards, the infantry, the artillery, the staff, the engineers, and the Prussians. Sometimes other branches were included if someone was here. So, for example, if one of Wellington's favorite doctors was here, the medical branch of the army would get a toast as well. The toasts and those who gave thanks were called out, were recorded in the press. The Times has usually the most detailed coverage to the point where either a reporter was given to the paper or by Wellington staff, or there was someone not in the banquet but near it listening in, because everyone wanted to know those names reported, how they were reported, especially the people's whose names they were. The banquet usually broke up around 10 or 11, and because this was the high entertainment days of the 19th century, the guests often made their way to other entertainments. In one year, the future William IV, then still the Duke of Clarence, and the Duke of Wellington spent the entire day together. Wellington was the guest of honor at a Waterloo regatta on the Thames, held by the Duke of Clarence. Then the Duke came here for the Waterloo Banquet, and then they both went off to Almack's for a ball afterwards. One year, a couple of years later, Victoria decided that she wanted to throw her own pseudo-Waterloo ball, decided it was going to be on June 18th, and just wholesale lifted the guest list from the Waterloo Banquet and dropped them in the invite list for her party. And so we have an account of several guests, including Wellington, literally leaving this house and just strolling across the park to Buckingham Palace for the next ball. Most everyone's impression of this event is going to be overall from that painting out there. William Salter's The Waterloo Banquet, 1836. And it gives us our best idea of what this looked like. 78 officers are depicted, and because of the importance of this event, all but 2 of them posed for it individually. Salter literally wrote to each one of them and said, "You were at the Wellington Banquet, I want you immortalized," and that's why every face in there is as good as it is. Wellington also gave Salter access to the house, the plate, etc. Wellington was very much old school patronage in this sense, right? It was going to be what he wanted, it was going to be what he depicted, and therefore he was going to make sure it worked. It was very popular on the engraving market. In fact, I was talking to Matthew earlier, and he said there's about 6 prints of it in the Houses of Parliament. So you can get what's going on here. The original, funnily enough, remained unsold until 1852, when it was sold to a Mr. Mackenzie. We know nothing else. But in the mid-20th century, the original purchaser's grandson, a major in the British Army, bequeathed it to the 8th Duke. And since then, it stands out there while the banquet took place in here. Thank you very much.
Folks, hello, ding ding, round 2 of, or at least take 2 of the introduction to a very dear friend. It's very rare that you find somebody who's bursting into the field who you know is going to take a discipline by storm. I will never forget the first time that I met Matthew. He was giving a talk in Winchester at the Rifles Museum, and at that point he wasn't a well-known, no disrespect, but you weren't a well-known name within the Napoleonic community. But within the first 5 minutes of his talk, I knew instantly that his was a name to watch. His book, Black Redcoats, is a fantastic exploration of the Corps of Colonial Marines in the War of 1812. It is no surprise to anybody who's read it that that was a key component of him being awarded a PhD by prior publication. But as you're about to be treated to, when Matthew speaks, he doesn't just speak with authority, he speaks with a passion that touches your soul. It's therefore a great pleasure to introduce to you the star, the person who has put this event together, Dr. Matthew Taylor.
And now the problem is I have to live up to that. Well, hello everyone, my name is Matthew Taylor and I'm presenting today the work of my dear friend and colleague John Ellis about the Black Soldiers of Waterloo. Now, in order to really get into this subject, we have to talk quite a lot of how and why. Why? My intention is to give you a lot of this kind of macro history, this macro social history, and then we're going to do one of the things I love about history, talk about 2 individuals. So the first thing is, at the Battle of Waterloo, on the British side, so not the whole Allied army, but in the British army at Waterloo, we are currently aware that there were 9 black British soldiers. We know this not through clear, definitive record keeping, but by accidental marginalia. Race was not something commonly recorded in records at the time. So sometimes we just get lucky with, say, one reference in the side of something. So those nine guys in the British force are not the totality of the probable black presence in the British forces at Waterloo. And the reason we're so confident about them being at Waterloo is because not only did we manage to identify them as black, they were also all awarded Waterloo medals. And the Waterloo medals were only awarded to the survivors. So all the men we know of survived the Battle of Waterloo. Those who may well have died there, we don't know. Now, the question that often gets thrown at me here is, how and why are black soldiers in Wellington's army at Waterloo? Well, and this is where we get all macro sociology and fun. So, in the late 18th century, in Western European armies, there was a fashionable movement, and this is one of these things where if you're military or military adjacent, you know that armies suffer fashions all the time. It's why everyone's wearing multicam nowadays and loves molly straps. It's because they make us look cool, right? In the late 18th century, the Western European armies saw the army of the Ottoman Empire's musical accompaniments, which were these incredible bands made up of musicians from the length and breadth of the Ottoman Empire, which was most of the Middle East, the Balkans, and so on. And the Western European armies were captured by the exoticism of this and wanted to reflect it in their own regiments. So that meant that what they wanted was bands with what were seen as kind of Turkish instruments, cymbals and big drums, things that we now think of as standard in military bands. But for that added extra level of authenticity, the officers who were largely in charge of recruiting and equipping these bands wanted black or brown-skinned people to be in their bands. So this is one of those moments where black skin is exoticized and commodified by Europe. It's not a symbol of a lesser status. It's symbol of exoticism and reflects the wealth, prestige, and worldliness of the officer. So obviously you get officers competing to have a complete band because then it's more authentic to the idea, if you see what I mean. And the deep irony of this is the authenticity is, of course, completely artificial. In the British military, the overwhelming majority of black bandsmen are recruited pretty much here in London, from the black community of London. The black community of London in the Georgian era probably numbered somewhere around 20 to 30,000 people in a city of less than 1 million people at the time. So it's a surprisingly large number. Our image of that part of London's history has been slightly skewed by the Victorian era, where the ethnic mix of London actually dipped a little bit during the Victorian era. In the Georgian era, it was much more polyglot than you might originally imagine. And this means, if you'll excuse me while I look at my notes, because there's so much to talk about. The question is, the army wants black soldiers for this one particular reason. Why do the black population of London join the army? And it's somewhat ironic here, because when you think of the army, you no doubt think of discipline and danger and potentially adventure and excitement and all that. But if you were a black citizen of London in the 18th century, the army is not only adventure and excitement, it's actually a place of security. If you join the army, you move from the unclear legal world of civilian life, where people can discriminate, people can be straight up racist in every way towards you, and you just have to roll with that. In the army, you become a soldier, a black soldier, yes, but a soldier first, and that gives you a certain prestige and power in the community. So lots of black soldiers join the ranks, and you can feel in the records we have the immediate kind of transformative effect it has. They're now, again, not only are they within the army and have the reflected prestige of the army, soldiers, by their very nature, are servants of the wider system. Civilians just live in it, but soldiers are part of the system, so they've moved up a level, if you see what I mean. Another important aspect of this is, in Britain at this time, there was what we can best describe as a completely skeletal social structure, largely derived from where you were born. So if you were in London and you collapsed into absolute poverty and got arrested for vagrancy or whatever, the authorities in London would figure out where you were born, what random part of Yorkshire you were from, and they would ship you back, because it's your parish of birth's responsibility to look after you. In London, if you're black and not born here, there's nowhere for you to go. So you don't even have that skeletal safety net. But if you're in the army and you make it through service in the army, there's probably a pension at the end. And that may well be your only income in old age. So in this regard, the army, by its need for men, and ironically, its somewhat colour blindness, at least amongst the ranks, provided a system that minoritized people could enter, and it is a structured, rules-based world in which they are on par with their white comrades. Very important step forward in a person's life. Pardon me. Now, the next macro aspect of this, which I always like to point out, is while you might have situations where you might only have one or two, nowadays at least, positively identified black men in the ranks, what we found by cross-referencing records is one of these delicious pieces of marginalia, which is one of the things that's the joy of doing this type of history. You might have, say, a black bandsman in one particular regiment, and he gets married, and when we go and look at who the witnesses are of the marriage, they're other black soldiers from completely different regiments, suggesting there is a community of black soldiers that exists within and alongside the military structure. And it gets very intriguing, because we even get to the point where you have situations where individual black soldiers get married, have children, and their children are marrying. So you have this community alongside the military generating itself. And again, when you think of the army, you think it as hierarchical and enclosed, but within, for some people of colour, it's actually a remarkably freeing situation to be in, whatever the dangers. However, military life in the Napoleonic Wars is by no means easy. And now I'm going to move to talking from the macro about how many people were in, how many of this group were in the military, to talk about some individuals. But before I quickly do that, I'm going to quickly talk about some of the other armies at Waterloo. In the Prussian army, there definitely was some black soldiers, again, nearly always in the military bands. And we know this because one of the few remaining records we have shows that black Prussian bandsmen were paid more than white Prussian bandsmen in order to keep them in the ranks, to keep this prestigious individual in the ranks. Digging any deeper into that is unfortunately now very difficult because the overwhelming majority of the Prussian army's military records were destroyed in 1945 during the Battle for Berlin, and creating a huge gap of knowledge for us. In the French army, we have an even more interesting kind of macro history, as I'm sure most of you in here are aware. When the French Revolution began, there was an initial emancipatory universalism, where the French Revolution declared all people to be equal, all slaves in French colonies were free, and it led to the revolutionary French army taking in large numbers of Afro-French people who wanted to be part of this great revolutionary movement. And then ironically, as I'm sure many of us are aware, where the revolutionary movement dissipated into Napoleonic imperialism, Napoleon reintroduced slavery to the French Empire, leading to the Haitian Revolution and the birth of the world's first black republic in Haiti. But if you were an individual, though, in the military, you could literally move through this. So there are men in the French army at Waterloo, some of whom were identified by Graeme Callister, who was speaking here earlier, who started by joining the French Revolutionary Army in the middle of the fervent of revolution. And they stuck in all the way through, even as eventually again, Napoleon, he banned conscription of non-white French people. So the large Afro-French community in Paris, for example, was suddenly told you can't join the army. It's very, very, very bizarre. So now, jumping back to the Brits, let's talk about two individuals. The first gentleman I'm going to talk about is a gentleman called George Rose. Now, George Rose, he was born in Spanish Town, Jamaica. His father was from Inverness in Scotland, and his mother was an enslaved woman. Well, George Rose, unlike many children of unions like this, he wasn't taken by his father and returned to the home island. Again, I should probably point out one of the great hypocrisies of British imperial history is that for the vast majority of this period, the British Empire has huge slave plantation colonies, largely in the Caribbean. But theoretically, to a great extent, here in England, there is no such thing as slavery. And you have a bizarre situation where enslaved people who made it out of the Gulag-esque Caribbean colonies, if they made it here, they were as good as anyone else. It's a very peculiar legal force field that people had to move through, if you see what I mean. And George Rose, he grew up in Jamaica as an enslaved boy, but at some point before 1809, he escaped from slavery. We know nothing about this. We just know this little detail. He escaped from slavery and made it here to Britain in 1809. Because here in Britain in 1809, he volunteered in the 73rd Regiment of Foot. But now his career from this point becomes a little scant on the details, because what we're doing is we're looking at those lines in military records. Right, but we can say that in his service in the 73rd, in 1811, he converted to Methodism. Now, Methodism was one of many kind of quite radical Anglicanist creeds at this time. One of its strongest aspects was anti-slavery. Methodism was a major source of abolitionist fervor. His military career took him to Germany in 1813 and in the Netherlands in 1814, fighting against Napoleon's forces. And because the 73rd were in the Netherlands in 1814 for the end of the war when Napoleon was sent to Elba, he was still there with his unit when Napoleon came back from the dead, as they often do. Yeah. Now, when we get to Waterloo, George Rose was with the 73rd. He wasn't just at Waterloo. The 73rd was also at Quatre Bras the day before. And while at Waterloo, George Rose was wounded wounded. The 73rd was in a square in a slightly more exposed position during that mighty cavalry charge Graeme and Michael talked about. So it took a lot of cannon and a lot of direct fire, while the other squares were a bit more shielded from the back of the ridge. And George took a shot in the arm. The 73rd, after the battle in 1816, as a veteran of the battle, he was awarded his Waterloo medal, and the 73rd was stood down as the army contracted. So he transferred to the 42nd Foot, which we now know better as the Black Watch. And unlike many of his black compatriots in the British Army, George Rose was always a private soldier. He was never a bandsman. But in all honesty, it's likely he had no musical talent, because it's very clear that they frequently tried to, why not the band? And he was immediately back in the ranks, if you see what I mean. But this meant that in the last years of his military career in the Black Watch, he would have been in the uniform for the Black Watch, red coat and kilt. Subsequently, from 1825 to 1837, after a couple of years in garrison duty here in Britain, his regiment went to Gibraltar, it went to Corfu, and to Malta. And George rose up the ranks to the highest rank that non-white soldiers tended to reach, which was just sergeant. There was an unofficial but very, very real colour bar on officers in the British military, which lasted almost to about the midway point through the 20th century, oddly enough. But he made it to sergeant, and it seems likely from the records that this happened because he was internally very self-disciplined, and that was a derivative of his Methodism. So he didn't fall into the normal soldier vexes. He didn't drink, he didn't gamble, he didn't brawl. He was a steady, obedient, and disciplined man. And he rose up the ranks to be in charge of other soldiers, which of course means that he was the NCO in charge of white British soldiers. And then in 1837, he finally left the army. He'd been in the British Army for 28 years. And because he left the army as a sergeant with a good record, he was awarded a relatively generous pension. And when he left the army, he mysteriously decided to go to Glasgow, a city of which he had zero previous connection at all. We think there's a solid clue about why, though. One or two of other soldiers who left the army at the same time also went to Glasgow and were also quite active Methodists. So we think he went with them to be part of that Methodist, kind of almost like a missionary attempt to go to deepest, darkest Glasgow to spread the good word. And in Glasgow, that's exactly what he did. He became an incredibly well-known figure. He preached on Glasgow Green. He had his arm, which had been wounded at Waterloo, had withered slightly. So he was a very imposing figure, a huge man with one slightly withered arm. He wore his medal and wasn't shy about his pride in being a veteran. But he was preaching what was called the primitive Methodism of the day, which is kind of a fundamentalist creed of getting back to basics Christianity. He got married in Glasgow to a woman called Mary. He had four children, the youngest of which actually only died in 1901, so into the 20th century. But George's life didn't end being a preacher in Glasgow. Very, very, very unusually, in terms of black history, in 1849, after his wife sadly died in Glasgow, he went back to Jamaica. He went back to Spanish Town, the town he'd been born enslaved in. This is now 14 years after the end of British slavery. Technically, it sputtered on in odd ways for a couple of years after the formal end. But he returned to the place he'd been born. Again, as a Methodist preacher, and post-slavery Jamaica was a place of immense difficulty because the entire economy of the British slave economy had been knocked out. So places like Jamaica were always suffering economic problems and social strife. And he went with his Methodism to preach the good word. And he lived on in Jamaica as, again, a well-known figure in the Methodist community until 1873, when he died at the age of 86 years old. Now George Rose's life is very interesting to me because George Rose, the 28 years he spent in the army were foundational to him as originally an enslaved man, becoming a free man and becoming a man of consequence in British society. So his military service was undoubtedly this great stepping stone that allowed that to happen in his life. But now, I need to quickly tell you about a man from Leicester called, pardon me, Leicester, good Lord, from Lincoln, called Peter Bishop. Now, Peter Bishop was another black British soldier. He was born, we believe, but we're unsure because there's lots of mixed records. He was born in Barbados. And he somehow made it to England, and he joined the British Army in 1806 when he was 14 years old. And he became a drummer in the 69th Regiment of Foot. And he was in the 69th Regiment of Foot for the following decade, and he was at Waterloo. The 69th at Waterloo had an absolutely horrendous time. It was overwhelmed by French cavalry at Quatre Bras with 150 casualties. And you have to imagine Peter Bishop. He's a drummer. He doesn't have a gun. He has a sword, maybe. And he's banging out the orders to form up. He's banging out the orders to form square. He's banging out the orders to fight and survive. And everyone around him is dying. And he's doing that. And then at Waterloo, because of the losses at Quatre Bras, his unit gets folded into another unit. That causes command confusion. The unit again suffers massive casualties. And the company he was in, which is about 100 men, suffered 57 casualties. So over half of the men around him were killed or harmed at the Battle of Waterloo. Peter Bishop immediately left the army in 1817, got his Waterloo medal, and he went to Lincoln. And we know about him, and we know so much about his life because he fell immediately into a terrible life of petty crime. And over the next 2 decades, he's in and out of prison. Not over major things. We're talking minor thieving, brawling, vagrancy. And the details of his life are all reflected in the court cases in technicolor and also terrible detail. He was married twice. Both of his wives died suddenly, very young. He had a child who died at only a month old, and he was arrested a week after his child's death and put in prison for a month. His life completely came apart after he left the army. And one of the last times he was ever found was in 1844. In 1844, in Bristol, a man encountered a vagrant who was black and said, "What's that you've got?" And this poor man who was only wearing, he was a striking figure because he was wearing a white pajama set. That was the only clothing he had. He was on the streets of Bristol, and round his neck he had a Waterloo medal, his only possession. And he told this diarist who he was. "My name's Peter Bishop. I was a drummer in the army at Waterloo." And the diarist noted that. Isn't that remarkable? Remarkable. A couple of years later, Peter Bishop pops up one last time. There's a census in 1851, and this is the only time that we are hearing Peter's voice rather than the voice of courts and authority figures. The census taker has to write down what he tells him. And Peter had been out of the army now for 30 years, and the census taker said to Peter Bishop, "What are you? What is your occupation?" And he said, "I am a former soldier of the 69th. And later that year, he died in Lincoln Workhouse. And they buried him, Peter Bishop, Tramp. Okay. Those two stories of these two black British men are very important to me because they're not only an example of black history, how non-white people navigated the social world of Georgian Britain, sometimes to their immense success in the case of George Rose, and other times detriment in the case of Peter Bishop. But both those stories, and I'm sure anyone here who's had military service in their lives recognizes we all know lads for whom the army was a foundational part of their growth. And we all know lads for whom the army was the best moment of their lives, and it all went wrong from there. And Peter Bishop and George Rose's stories are part of that universal military service story as much as they are unique and exciting records of what it was like to be a minority person in Britain's Georgian period. Thank you.
What you've just heard is only the beginning. For more from the show, scroll back through the 400 plus episodes we have in our back catalogue, and make sure that you subscribe or follow so that you can stay up to date with our latest instalments. Got a question? Disagree with something we've said? Then post in the comments section and we'll get back to you. And don't forget that you can enjoy early access, ad-free listening, exclusive episodes, socials, and so much more on Patreon. We've put the link in the description. Shout outs to our patrons who, at the time of recording, were in the mentioned in dispatches tier: Brendan Teeling, Beatrice de Graaf, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Jim Getz, Jeff Maple, Robin Brasher, Harriet Bradley, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Rob Coughlin, Bruins Girl, Noah Fink, Miles Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Anthony Gumbau, Anonymous American, James Fluick, Natasha Hobday, Rod Schwager, Chris Kimball, Ted Andrews, Richard Scott Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Joe Ayres, Peter Findlay, Steve, John Baptiste Van Merlen, Adam Coslin, Tessa Blaber, Walker Wonders, Daniel Friedman, Neil Reed, Jonathan Willits, Wojciech Stefanovic, EJB, Simon Weathers, Zach Johnson, John Chuck, Nick Beckstrom, Matthew Turner, Rich Payne, Edward Gilhead, Vic Martindale, John Parkin, Steve Walker, The Bald Monk, John Hennigan, Mark Somerville, Yay Zach Mentioned Me, Craig Martin, Hoplite, and C.T. Murphy. The Admirals: John Haynes, Lynn Dawson, J.C. Kaiser, Michael Guest, Rachel Stark, Mark Duckers, Ian Harding, David Maxwell, David Priest, Graeme Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, John and Casey Randall, Kate Walcombe, Retta the Sci-Fi Fan, Clemens Beman, Tim Pritchard, Darla Vincent, Jason Morn, Rob Painter, Stephen Ashworth, The Iron Duke, Nikia Craig, Vincent Cervantes, and Jeff Frazier. And in the Crown Yourself tier, Emperor of the First French Empire Todd Campbell, Duke of Wellington Laird Campbell, Poultry Prince of Pukalani Bob Burnham, First Lord of the Treasury Ryan Diamond, Chard of Wellington Jarl Brian Silcott, and too Jacobin to crown oneself, Dan Hazelwood. We'll be back very soon, but until then, this has been the Napoleonic Wars Pod. Take care of yourselves, folks, stay well, stay safe, and as always, thank you for listening.